When I was 12, my parents told me they were sending me to a summer camp for 2 weeks. I was quite the homebody at that age, and I think they thought this would help me develop social skills before I ended up with some anxiety issue. Looking back, I understand their reasoning. No parent wants their child to grow up as a strange loner who feels disconnected from the world. Attending that camp did give me a bit more confidence in dealing with people, but it certainly wasn't in the way they had hoped. To say I wasn't excited about going to summer camp would be an understatement. When my parents told me, I nearly cried right there. I swore I would do anything to avoid being sent to what I thought would be a wilderness prison for 2 weeks. I tried to improve my hygiene and act friendlier, but my parents weren't open to negotiating. They were giving me an order. I was going to camp whether I liked it or not, and if they had to drag me kicking and screaming onto the bus, so be it. Honestly, I cried myself to sleep the night before departure, and I was fighting tears on the way to the bus that would take us to camp. It was only when I got on the bus with the other kids that I thought I wouldn't cry again. Even then, I was frozen in fear, surrounded by a group of loud teens. 3 kids even asked me what was wrong, and all I could do was sit there, gripped by anxiety as they speculated if I was different. It was incredibly humiliating, and I actually wondered if I could escape during a break at a rest stop. But where would I go? What would I do? It was a classic case of being stuck between a rock and a hard place, and I obviously chose the hard place. The first few days at camp were challenging, to say the least. I barely talked to anyone, disliked the food, and found the activities to be my version of hell. I admit I was spoiled in that sense, having always eaten my favorite foods while sleeping in my own bedroom as an only child. The reality of eating mediocre food and sleeping in a cabin with 5 other kids was a tough adjustment. My anxiety peaked during mealtimes, especially because the boys and girls camps shared the dining hall. It wasn't all the girls that made me anxious either. There was one girl in particular named Samantha. She was the most beautiful girl I had ever seen. Popular, smart, graceful, and confident. During lunch and dinner, I found myself staring at her, except when she looked my way. Then I'd just focus on my food, praying she didn't notice me. I was torn between hoping she'd come over to talk to me and wishing she'd stay far away so I wouldn't embarrass myself. Eventually, one of those prayers was answered, and it led to one of the most nerve-wracking moments of my life. I'll never forget how sweet her voice was when she asked if she could sit with me for a few moments. I completely froze, but she was confident enough to smile, giggle, and sit down across from me. Once she started asking my name and where I was from, I managed to pull myself together enough to talk. Her curiosity about me, combined with the envious looks from other boys, gave me a significant confidence boost. I wasn't suddenly transformed into a social butterfly, but I felt a little lighter for the rest of the day. The same thing happened the next evening at dinner when Samantha came over to chat about various topics. By the end of the week, I had made friends with 2 other socially awkward kids, and she finally asked me the crucial question: if I wanted to meet her down at the swimming lake that night before lights out. As you might guess, this was completely against camp rules. Boys and girls were not allowed to socialize outside of designated activities or in the dining hall, but that made it all the more exciting for me. She clearly liked me enough to risk getting in trouble, and believe it or not, there was a time when I would have jumped at the chance to go home early. However, after meeting and talking to Samantha, I realized I didn't want to leave at all. The thrill of this secret meeting made me nervous, but I said yes and planned how I would sneak down to the lake without getting caught by the counselors. When the time came, my friends wished me luck and gave me tips on how to play it cool. I made my way to the lake, but my heart sank when I found that she wasn't there. I feared I had built up my hopes for nothing, but felt too anxious to leave in case she showed up and thought I wasn't interested. I waited for 5 minutes, then 10, and finally heard someone approaching the trail. Out from the trees came none other than Samantha, carrying 2 towels. As we talked, I felt a mix of nerves, excitement, fear, and joy. Above all, it felt like a victory. I could socialize, I could date pretty girls, and perhaps even become one of the popular kids. My ego might have inflated dangerously, but by the time Samantha arrived, I couldn't see how our meeting could go wrong. When she suggested we strip down to our swimwear and go for a quick swim, I was so infatuated that I didn't consider how it might not be the best idea. We changed into our swimsuits and stepped off the dock into the water. It was cold, which was a blessing, as it allowed me to pretend I was shaking from the chill rather than from nerves about being in my swimsuit with such a pretty girl. We swam quietly for a while, and at one point, Samantha shared that she loved swimming and was on a competitive team at her school back in Willow Creek. She mentioned that she could hold her breath for almost a minute and asked if I wanted to see her prove it. I was happy to watch, so I said yes. When she sank under the water, I counted until she resurfaced, gasping for air after 52 seconds. I was thoroughly impressed. That was an incredible feat for someone of her size. Then she asked how long I could hold my breath. I told her I didn't know, but I would gladly go under the water so she could count for me. I ducked down, hearing her sweet voice counting above me, and I tried to keep track of the seconds while my lungs started to ache. Suddenly, I noticed her counting had stopped, just as I felt something enter the water beside me. I kicked to the surface to see what it was, and that's when I felt a hand on my head, pushing me down and keeping me submerged. I opened my eyes and saw that Samantha was no longer in front of me, meaning whoever was holding me down must have been behind me or up on the dock. Panic set in as I reached up to remove the hand, but it wouldn't budge. I had always been a bit weak, and with my lungs burning, I found it impossible to fight back. After a few seconds, I started to lose consciousness, and my last thought was that I was going to die. That realization sparked a final rush of panic, but then I felt an odd sense of calm wash over me. I stopped struggling and just let go. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the dock, coughing up water as someone asked if I could hear them. In a daze, I couldn't remember what had happened. As I looked around, I saw Samantha crying while one of the counselors comforted her. It was only then that the memory of the hand holding me under returned. I had gone from feeling the happiest I'd ever been to thinking I was dying. I had no idea who had held me under, but Samantha did, and her guilt made her confess quickly to the counselor. Apparently, it had been an elaborate prank aimed at me, the nervous kid, but she didn't know they planned to drown me. From what I gathered, she had panicked when she saw them keeping me underwater for too long and rushed to get a counselor to intervene. EMTs and police arrived shortly after, and I was taken to the head counselor's office. As you can imagine, it became a huge deal. What was intended to be a cruel prank turned into what law enforcement labeled attempted murder. The kids involved were arrested and taken away that night, and the one who held my head under ended up in juvenile detention for a couple of years. My parents came to pick me up the next day, and my mom gave the head counselor a piece of her mind about potentially seeing them in court before practically shoving me into the car. I didn't cry when I went to camp, but I did cry when leaving. I felt a whirlwind of emotions. I was glad to escape a place where I almost lost my life, but sad to leave my first real friends and Samantha behind. I knew she was part of the prank against me, and while I felt some bitterness about that, I also recognized that she cared enough to seek help when she realized they were trying to harm me. I can't describe how much that meant to me, and looking back, I realize how strange that sounds, but in my naive 12-year-old mind, it was proof she liked me, even if not in the way I wanted. In an odd twist, almost dying at camp turned out to be one of the best experiences of my life. I learned that death, the scariest thought I had, wasn't so terrible when confronted directly. I found a sense of acceptance and peace, and after that moment, I realized I wasn't scared of much anymore. I discovered I could make friends, that I could be brave, and I ended up trying things I never thought I could, like Anatoly Slivkoff was born on December 28, 1938, in the Dagestan region of the former Soviet Union. Following a harsh childhood impacted by the hardships of World War II, he built a life for himself in the city of Novaya Mysk, near Stavropol. He had 2 children with his wife, Ludmila. To outsiders, Anatoly was an exemplary communist and a cornerstone of the community, dedicating much of his time to a local children's organization. Each summer, this group organized camps that provided hardworking parents a temporary break from child-rearing responsibilities. Parents trusted their kids with Anatoly, but this trust was tragically misplaced, as he hid a dark secret that wouldn't be revealed until it was far too late. In 1961, Anatoly witnessed a terrible traffic accident while returning home from downtown Novaya Mysk. A drunk driver on a heavy Soviet motorcycle had sped around a nearly blind turn, crashing into a group of pedestrians. One of the victims was a young boy in a Young Pioneers uniform, a youth organization akin to the Boy Scouts in America. The boy's body was in a horrific state, clearly killed on impact, with his head and neck nearly crushed. Yet, his uniform remained oddly intact, creating an image that Anatoly would remember for the rest of his life. The memory wasn't haunting due to the violence or the uniform, but because it was the first time Anatoly felt an unsettling desire from witnessing the remains of a deceased child. He later described how, as the smell of gasoline and smoke filled the air, he succumbed to a fog of intense longing. In the months that followed, Anatoly sought ways to get closer to local children without raising suspicion from their parents. It quickly became clear that he could gain their trust by becoming a local youth leader. Once he earned the community's complete confidence, he would exploit his position to carry out horrifying acts of abuse. The most vulnerable children were those attending the annual summer camps run by the youth organization, where they were away from their guardians. During these camps, Anatoly focused on specific boys aged 11 to 15, who were usually shorter for their age and easily manipulated. He would convince them to wear the Young Pioneers uniform, just like the boy from the tragic accident. Once dressed, he would instill fear in them by suggesting that their small stature would lead to bullying. When they expressed a desire to be taller, he would claim to know of an experiment involving a method of controlled stretching of the spine. Essentially, he would hang the boys as if it were an execution, but assured them he would rescue them once they lost consciousness. In some cases, he would tell groups of boys they were to reenact a partisan's hanging by Nazi soldiers, emphasizing the honor associated with playing the role of a Soviet martyr. Generally, Anatoly kept his word, reviving the boys shortly after they passed out. However, he would strip them and subject their unconscious bodies to unspeakable acts that they would never recall. On several occasions, once the boys were utterly helpless, Anatoly committed far worse actions. Over the next 22 years, he allegedly persuaded nearly 50 boys to take part in his grotesque experiments. In 36 instances, he revived the boys, often photographing the abuse before forcing them to vow silence. But in 7 of these cases, his thoughts drifted back to that fateful day. He saw the young pioneer convulsing, surrounded by blood, smoke, and flames. In those moments, he would begin to dismember the boys while they were still alive, starting with their heads, then pouring gasoline over their remains before setting them ablaze, all to relive the horror of the traffic accident from 1961, which had awakened his twisted desires. Once disposed of, Anatoly would keep their shoes as sick trophies, along with the photographs he had taken, to remember those he had slaughtered. As horrifying as it may be to acknowledge, these perverse keepsakes likely saved numerous lives. Whenever he felt the urge to kill, he would revisit these items, which seemed to quell his craving for the sight of blood and the burning flesh of innocent children. It was only when he grew weary of his trophies that he sought to relive the scenes of the accident again, potentially preventing many more than just 7 young victims. On June 2, 1964, Anatoly claimed his first victim, a 15-year-old runaway named Nikolai Dobrchev. Anatoly later insisted that Nikolai's death was an accident. He failed to revive the boy once he lost consciousness. Realizing the young man was dead, Anatoly dismembered the body and buried it in the woods near the summer camp. He then destroyed all the photos of Nikolai, fearing they could be used against him for murder. In May 1965, Anatoly took his second victim, Alexei Kovalenko, who was attending a summer camp where Anatoly was a trusted counselor. The photographs he took of Alexei held his monstrous lust at bay for 8 years. However, on November 14, 1973, a 15-year-old boy named Alexander Nezhmianov vanished from the streets of Anatoly's hometown. The investigation by the Soviet police failed to connect Anatoly to the boy's disappearance. 2 years later, another child was abducted, 11-year-old Andrei Pigushin, who went missing after telling his mother that a man had invited him to a nearby forest to star in a short film. This time, Anatoly's reputation as a filmmaker led the police to visit him, but his standing in the community meant they merely inquired if he knew the identity of this mysterious director. Anatoly claimed ignorance, and they left him unbothered. The close call with law enforcement made Anatoly wait another 5 years before snatching another child, biding his time until 1980, when he became fixated on a 13-year-old named Sergei Fatnev, who bore a striking resemblance to the dying young pioneer. His final victim was taken in July 1985, when 13-year-old Sergei Pavlov vanished after telling a neighbor he was going to meet the leader of Churchit. This revelation implicated Anatoly, as he was the public face of the Churchit youth organization. In November 1985, a Soviet prosecutor began investigating Anatoly concerning Sergei Pavlov's disappearance. While questioning club members, the prosecutor learned that many of them had experienced what was described as temporary amnesia during summer camp. When pressed for details, the boys frequently mentioned Anatoly's abhorrent experiments, noting they would black out and then awaken feeling sore and tender. Following the prosecutor's investigation, a shocking narrative of abuse began to emerge, all pointing back to Anatoly and his summer camps. Finally, in December 1985, police visited Anatoly's home in Stavropol and arrested him on 7 counts of murder. It remains unclear if he was tortured in custody or if another method was used to obtain his cooperation, but within a month, Anatoly led officers to the burial sites of 6 of his 7 victims after confessing in detail. The Soviet judge overseeing his trial was deeply disturbed by the nature of his crimes and believed the only just punishment was a death sentence. Following the sentencing, Anatoly was placed on death row at Nabokarkaz prison, marking the end of a 2-decade spree of abuse and murder that robbed nearly 50 boys of their innocence. However, in 1989, Anatoly was given a final chance to save his life. Police from Rostov Oblast approached him, stating that if he could help them identify a mysterious serial killer, his death sentence could be commuted to life in prison. This serial killer had already claimed at least 29 children's lives, and the authorities had no leads to follow. The killer turned out to be the notorious Andrei Chikatilo, who would eventually be convicted of murdering 52 women and children in October 1992. Anatoly did his best to assist with the investigation, providing insights into his own criminal mentality, but it was of no use to the Rostov officers. Following the interrogation, Anatoly was forcibly removed from the interview room and taken to an execution chamber. As he pleaded for his life, a prison officer pressed the barrel of his gun to the back of Anatoly's head and pulled the trigger, ending his life with a single shot. In a twisted sense, this was a more dignified death than what he had inflicted upon his victims. Vulnerable boys who had no idea they were placing their trust in a man with malevolent intentions. Their deaths served only to fulfill the sick fantasies of a truly evil individual. When the executioner ended Anatoly's life in September 1989, the world undoubtedly became a little brighter. I grew up in a small town called Birchwood, located a couple of hours' drive from Edmonton, Alberta, nestled along the river that shares its name. Birchwood was a great place to be raised, and for about 4 to 5 months each year, the town transformed into a true winter wonderland. As a result, winter sports were a huge part of my life, along with other snowy activities like building snowmen and throwing snowballs at my childhood friend who lived nearby on 52nd Street. Alberta felt like home, and I thought the farthest I would move would be to Edmonton for work. However, my family would eventually take me farther from home than I ever expected. My career choice led me to live and work in Brisbane, Australia. I moved there in 2007, met a girl, got married, and we decided to settle down and start a family in Australia. Since my family was more able to travel, they flew over to Brisbane about once or twice a year during the first few years of their grandchildren's lives. They had only heard stories about their dad's homeland and, more importantly, had never seen snow. My daughter, Lily, was just about 6, and my son, Ben, was 4 when my wife and I decided it was time for a change. We organized a trip back to Alberta for Christmas in 2017. Lily was especially excited, while Ben had no idea what to expect. When we landed in Edmonton and drove the 80 miles to my parents' house, their minds were blown by the fluffy white blankets of snow lining the highway. Showing them my old hometown was a fantastic experience, and the kids had a wonderful time with their grandparents. But what truly captivated their attention was the snow. It's worth noting that in Australia, Christmas is celebrated much like it is in Canada, except for the weather. Deep winter in the northern hemisphere is high summer in the southern, so despite all the festive, wintry advertising, it can be blisteringly hot outside in December. I can't express how strange it is to see a restaurant display fake snow on its sign when it's 40 degrees Celsius in the shade. I often get the impression that Australians would happily zap their entire country with a frost ray for 24 hours just to match the festivities. For my kids, having the scenery match the Christmas spirit felt as magical as a trip to Disneyland and came at half the price. They wanted to be outside in the snow every waking moment, doing all the things I had loved as a kid. Wearing warm winter clothing was such a novelty for them, too. Lily once said she couldn't decide if she felt more like an Eskimo or an astronaut. It was that new to them. They loved it so much that when my wife spotted an advertisement for a winter glamping experience at a place called Frosty Lodge, we eagerly booked an overnight stay in one of their family-sized yurts. We drove there on December 22nd, arriving around noon, and by 1:30, we were all set up and ready to build a snowman army. We played in the snow for a few hours. Then my wife went into the yurt to prepare dinner on the small camping stove provided by the lodge. The kids and I continued playing as the sky began to darken. After one particularly intense snowball fight, where my kids formed an unexpected alliance and teamed up against me, we started feeling pretty hungry. We were only about 50 yards from the yurt, so after telling my daughter to keep an eye on her little brother, I jogged back to check on my wife. She said dinner would be ready in just a few minutes. I then jogged back to where the kids had been playing and saw Lily starting to build the base of yet another snowman. But when I looked around for Ben, he was nowhere in sight. I assumed he couldn't have gone far, but after searching and not finding him, I asked Lily where he was. She looked up from her snowman, glanced around, and then a look of visible concern crossed her face when she realized he was missing. She looked at me with a trembling voice and said, "I don't know. I think she thought I would be mad at her." I was a bit upset, but that anger was completely overtaken by a frantic panic that only a parent knows. Then I remembered I could track Ben's little boot prints in the snow. I followed his trail until I was greeted by a sight that sent a chill through me as a parent. A frigid stream. It didn't look too deep or wide, but it was just the right size for a 4-year-old to fall in and get swept away. An older child might have been able to cross the series of small stepping stones at one of its narrower and shallower sections. But if Ben fell downstream, he could easily drown in that icy water. I ran up and down the banks of the stream, desperately looking for my son's body while shouting his name, hoping he'd hear me and come running. Those were the most terrifying moments of my life, made even worse by the fact that my daughter was right there, witnessing my terrified breakdown. I can't imagine how frightened she was. Not only did she not fully understand what was happening, but she also felt responsible for it. I kept running up and down the bank, not paying much attention to the opposite side of the stream. It seemed impossible that Ben had crossed it on his own without being overwhelmed by the current. Then, I finally heard him call out to me. I turned around to see him standing right where I hadn't expected him, on the other side of the stream. He didn't seem scared or anxious. He was just trudging through the snow in his coat and boots like he didn't have a care in the world. I definitely startled him when I bounded across the stream, ran up to him, and scooped him up into my arms. I didn't yell at him, but he definitely picked up on my energy and started crying when he saw his sister, who was also in tears by that point. I carried him back to the yurt, where my very confused and upset wife greeted us. When I explained what had happened, she was angry with me, then mad at Lily, then back to being mad at me again. We were all a mess, but mostly just relieved we found Ben and avoided being the cause of an Amber Alert. Once we calmed down, we had dinner and started putting the kids to bed. Before tucking Ben in, who was almost completely worn out, I asked him something that had been nagging at me since just after dinner. I asked him how he got across the stream. We were all incredibly relieved to have found him safe, so that was all I could think about until we finished eating. When I was running along the banks of the stream, I had expected him to be on our side or in the water. It seemed impossible that he could have crossed on his own. I wanted to find out what happened, so I asked him, and his answer sent chills down my spine. The snowman carried me. Now, obviously, a snowman couldn't have carried my son across an icy stream, but someone did. Just the thought of it made me feel sick. I told Ben that couldn't have been true. I asked again very gently if the snowman he meant was actually a person wearing white clothes or maybe someone with snow on their hair or shoulders. He shook his head and repeated, "The snowman carried me." Before I could ask anything else, he closed his eyes and fell asleep. I don't think he was out for more than 5 or 10 minutes. I told my wife what our son had just said, and soon we were packing up our things, dressing the kids, and heading to our car. What happened was bizarre, but it was clear that someone had taken my son, even if it was only for a minute or two. Thank God they had the sudden urge to let him go. Maybe because they heard my screams and decided to run before getting caught. I was grateful for that, but wasn't about to stay overnight while being potentially stalked by a child snatcher. We made sure to inform a representative of the campground on our way out. I don't know what they did in response, but there was no way we were staying there. We drove home without even thinking to ask for a refund, still shaken by the experience. The very next morning, I contacted the police regarding what had happened. Not long after, they called us back to confirm our worst fears. On the other side of the stream, along with Ben's smaller footprints, were a set of much larger footprints that I was convinced belonged to his potential abductor. Ben later mentioned that the person who had carried him wore a white hat or at least light-colored clothing, and that after carrying him for a minute or two through the woods, they simply set him down and walked away. Ben heard my yelling and trudged off in the direction of my voice, leading to our reunion. I asked Ben if the man had said anything to him, and he said no. When I asked if he had been scared, oddly, he said no to that too. My son wasn't the kind of child to be overly trusting or friendly, so it was unusual for him not to react if a stranger picked him up. When I asked if he had cried or yelled out or struggled when the stranger had appeared and scooped him up, Ben again just said no. Maybe he thought it was me. Maybe he was mesmerized by the magical and alien landscape in the woods. Perhaps he was just sleepy, which is why he didn't freak out. But thinking about that stranger taking my son and Ben not even making a sound sends shivers down my spine. Long-time lurker here, finally sharing a tale with you all, and you'll be glad to hear it isn't one of those creepy guy stared at me stories. Instead, it's about how my college buddy, Marcus, and I nearly got killed in the woods. I know some listeners might think that almost got killed means a lot of creepy staring and very little actual danger, but hold tight. I have the story and the scar to prove it. I don't know what got into me and my friend Marcus during college, but we got really into survivalism during our sophomore year at the University of Colorado, Denver. Living off campus, working part-time jobs, and being just a stone's throw away from places like Mount Evans and the Rockies, we started hiking as a way to get exercise and relieve stress. We had hiked during our freshman year on campus, but once we moved to an apartment near Colfax Avenue, we watched a movie one night in mid-October called Alive. This movie tells the true story of a rugby team from South America whose plane crashes in the Andes Mountains. The injured survivors have to eat the flesh of their deceased friends to survive, which helps them orchestrate their rescue. It's a gripping film that really captivated both Marcus and me. We couldn't help but wonder what we would do in a similar situation, mainly debating how hungry we'd have to be before resorting to cannibalism. Obviously, we didn't want to test that theory, but we figured we could do the next best thing. Head into the mountains during the winter and try camping for a night or two to see if we could handle it. Now, let me emphasize that you should not try this at home. Camping in the wilderness can be dangerous, especially in the dead of winter, but naturally, my college-age buddy Marcus and I thought it was a brilliant idea. So we began planning a camping weekend for after the holidays. We kept arranging things over Christmas, and the first weekend back at school, we drove to Echo Lake Park near Mount Evans to park our car before heading into the snowy woods towards Mount Goliath. After hiking a couple of miles, we found a great sheltered spot among some pine trees. We set down our gear and started clearing a space for our camp. I won't bore you with the details of how miserable it was to camp under those conditions. It was pretty awful. Everything stayed wet all the time, making it hard to keep the fire going, and we hardly got any sleep. It was so bad that we decided to pack up around 6:30 or 7 a.m. to use the early light to navigate back to our car and escape to the warmth of home and hot showers. I used my jet boil to make us some coffee inside the tent. If you don't have one, I highly recommend getting one. Once we were warm and caffeinated, we started packing up our things. Marcus finished before me and opened the tent flap, saying he was going to take a quick bathroom break. I groaned, still half asleep, and continued my packing. A few moments later, Marcus returned, squatting by the entrance of the tent, and asked, "Is your knife within reach?" The first thing that crossed my mind was that he must have seen a bear or something. Sometimes bears wake up early from hibernation and, without food around, can be a significant danger to campers. But when I asked Marcus what was wrong, he said, "There's a guy out here." I felt relieved to hear it wasn't a starving bear. It was just a man. I almost laughed, thinking about how some early morning hiker might have given Marcus a strange look while relieving himself. I chuckled and asked if that was all that scared him. That's when Marcus told me the guy had a gun. This didn't alarm me too much either. Sure, the man was hunting out of season, but if everyone panicked every time they saw an armed person in Colorado, the entire state would be in chaos. I don't know if I was too tired, too cold, or just eager to get out of there, but I couldn't grasp the seriousness of the situation. Maybe Marcus wasn't explaining it well, but I just sat there confused when we should have been fleeing. Suddenly, Marcus turned his head away, and I heard him scream for me to get out of the tent. I hadn't finished packing, but I jumped out as he instructed. Facing what terrified Marcus, I saw a lone hunter wearing a ski mask covering his entire face. He didn't say anything as we backed away from him. I can't recall our exact words, but we must have said something like, "We don't want any trouble, and if we trespassed, we didn't mean to. We'll leave." We kept talking, but this guy remained silent. Then he raised his rifle and aimed at us. What happened next is a blur. I remember seeing him lift the gun, and we both turned and ran as if our lives depended on it. The first shot was the loudest noise I'd ever heard, echoing all around us as we sprinted through the forest, away from our campsite. It felt like ages passed between the first and second shots, and I thought, he's aiming at us, and I'm dead. Then, bang, I felt something hit the back of my left thigh. I dropped but found I could still pick myself up and keep running, even without Marcus's help. I knew I'd been hit, not just from the jolt of the bullet fragment striking my leg, but also from the warm blood spilling down my thigh. It was a strange sensation, hot and cold at once. I ran faster, feeling the warmth mingling with the cold air hitting my skin, and I never want to feel that again. Long story short, we managed to get down the mountain after the hunter either lost sight of us or decided to get away before we could call the police. To say I got lucky would be an understatement. I had been hit, but not by a full bullet. Thanks to the trees, the hunter struggled to get a clear shot, and the bullet struck a tree, fragmenting and slashing the top rear of my thigh as I ran through the snow. The doctor told me that if the bullet had hit the tree differently or if I had been running slower, the fragment could have pierced my thigh and severed my femoral artery, killing me within minutes. Thankfully, that didn't happen, and I try not to think about it too hard. Dwelling on it brings back some intense fears, much like that hot and cold sensation I'd prefer not to experience again, or even ever. As for the guy who shot at us, the police questioned a few hunters but never arrested anyone or charged anyone for nearly killing us up there. If you ask me, I think the man was just a hunter who didn't intend to shoot anyone. But there are certainly people out there who want to know what it feels like to kill. I'm not saying all hunters think like that, far from it. I just know that at least one of them does. I used to work as a camp counselor at a summer camp in Florida, doing 2 consecutive years. The first summer went well, so I decided to return. I recognized many familiar faces, including counselors and campers, but there were also plenty of new ones that summer, including some great kids and some not-so-great ones. The worst of them was a kid we'll call Damian because he was a total nightmare. He was clearly trouble from the moment he arrived at camp. Damian was unkind to the other kids, disrespectful to counselors, and refused to follow directions. He had a vocabulary of curse words that was surprisingly advanced for a 9-year-old. We could handle brats, but a little psycho who genuinely frightened us was another matter entirely. Over the following week, Damian showed us he was just that. Damian was involved in 3 separate incidents, each more troubling than the last. The first was a minor fight with another kid. Nothing too serious, just a brief tussle that we had to break up and report to cover ourselves. Our head counselor reached out to his parents, suggesting they pick him up early, but they were on vacation and told us to deal with it or they'd sue for a full refund. After that, we attempted to keep Damian apart from most of the other kids by placing him with others who weren't as easy to pick on. This worked for a while, but it soon became clear that he was influencing the others negatively. The second incident occurred when a counselor went to check on Damian and his so-called friends in their cabin. They were unusually quiet, which was odd since they usually made a ruckus. When the counselor entered, she found Damian and his buddies huddled in a corner, fixated on something he had. The kids scattered when she walked in, and Damian hastily hid whatever it was under one of the bunk beds. The counselor asked to see his hands, but he just shook his head. Since we weren't allowed to physically touch the kids unless it was an emergency, she told them that if they showed her what Damian was hiding, they wouldn't get in trouble. One of them pointed under the bed, and she knelt down to look. What she found was a dead possum, or at least we thought it was a possum based on its size and shape. It could have been another animal, but Damian had clearly removed all its fur and turned it inside out. His hands were smeared with blood, and he had literally been caught red-handed. The other kids' hands were clean, but the fact that they silently watched while Damian mutilated an animal was horrifying. We had to report this, so we contacted Damian's parents again, saying they needed to either pick him up or we'd call the authorities for animal cruelty. We were hesitant to involve the police, knowing it could lead to negative publicity for the camp, which we couldn't afford. Damian's parents promised to end their vacation early, but said they couldn't get to camp for another day. It would be a long 2 days with Damian still causing chaos, but we couldn't keep him locked in his cabin. The next day, we took the kids on a history walk through the woods to a nearby Seminole tribe museum. The land the camp occupied used to belong to the Seminoles, and we wanted to teach the kids to appreciate and respect that history. The museum visit was a highlight, where a tribe member would discuss their history before the kids got to make headdresses. The 9-year-olds were the youngest group we took, and of course, Damian had to come along under strict supervision. Looking at the historical weapons was the only time Damian appeared quiet and interested. He was particularly captivated by a Seminole tomahawk on display and asked the museum curator if the Seminoles used them in battles. The curator mistakenly shared that they used them to scalp enemies, and I could see Damian's fascination growing. I had a sinking feeling about what he was concocting in his mind. Later that evening, as the kitchen team finished cleaning up after dinner, one of them started complaining about a missing knife. We overheard a back and forth between 2 staff members, one accusing the other of borrowing it. When someone mentioned the 4th graders had eaten last, I immediately thought, "Oh no, Damian." Rushing to his cabin, I heard a terrifying scream from inside. Bursting in, I found Damian holding one of his friends by the hair with a knife in the other hand. He was about to scalp the poor kid, and if I hadn't yelled his name, I truly believe he would have gone through with it. It was the look in his eyes and the grin on his face that sent chills down my spine. Part of me feared I was about to witness something horrific. Thankfully, his instinct was to hide the evidence under a bunk bed. After that, he tried to sneak past us as if he were playing a game. We detained him in the counselor's cabin and finally did what we should have done after discovering the dead possum. We called the police. The head counselor made the call, and when the officers arrived, they didn't seem surprised by Damian's behavior. We had no idea what would happen next, but the junior counselors and I thought they might take him to juvenile detention. After all, he had tried to scalp another kid. Imagine our shock when we learned that they couldn't arrest anyone under 10 years old, and it was up to us to contact Damian's parents to come get him. At least the police gave us the go-ahead to keep him confined in the counselor's office until his parents arrived. The next morning, he managed to wreak havoc, causing even more organizational issues, but compared to everything else, that was minor. When his parents finally showed up, we understood why Damian was the way he was. It was clear his home life was not healthy. The head counselor mentioned that they would likely receive a visit from social services, and it seemed only a matter of time before Damian wouldn't be living with them any longer, either because they weren't fit to be parents or because he needed serious help from a child psychologist. I never found out what ultimately happened to Damian, but I truly hope he received the assistance he needed. I don't believe children are born evil. They're shaped by their surroundings. If his parents were any indication, Damian was raised in a very troubled environment. Hello, I'm Daniel, an assistant researcher at Vancouver State University, focusing on atmospheric science. This field examines weather and climate by connecting with other areas, like chemistry, math, and environmental engineering. Most of my recent work has revolved around climate change, but at the start of this year, I joined a unique research initiative with Almaty University in Kazakhstan. Our task was to translate and validate previously unreleased research data, recently obtained from the Kazakh government. To understand why this job was assigned to us, a bit of context is necessary. Unlike some former Soviet nations that faced chaos during the USSR's fall, Kazakhstan quickly consolidated power under a leader named Nursultan. Sultan was, to put it mildly, eccentric. He did things like renaming Kazakhstan's capital after himself and importing sand from tropical beaches to make a fake resort. He also commissioned massive, peculiar skyscrapers, which appear empty and serve no purpose other than creating a futuristic vibe for Almaty, or Nur-Sultan, as the city was once named. When the Soviets withdrew, Sultan and his allies secured control over all government properties, including scientific research stations built across the USSR. While former Soviet territories gradually shared research data with Western institutions, Kazakhstan did not. Sultan hoarded all research information, supposedly to protect it from Western espionage. Whether he was actually guarding national interests or just asserting his power, most of the Soviet-era data stayed classified until he resigned in 2022. Once he stepped down, two of Kazakhstan's top universities, one now bearing Sultan's name, gained custody of the data and shared it with Almaty University, which then granted us access at Vancouver State. First, we needed clearance to access these materials, but the second challenge lay in determining the credibility of the data. Soviet science, especially in atmospheric research, often lagged in areas like agriculture and biology due to the influence of ideology, which sometimes replaced solid science with unreliable conclusions. One notorious example is the Soviet agricultural scientist Trofim Lysenko, whose flawed theories led to widespread famine. Lysenko manipulated data to support his claims, using misleading statistics and small sample sizes to enforce disastrous farming policies across the USSR and, later, China. Many scientists who dared to contradict him faced harsh penalties or even imprisonment. My task involved identifying such biases in Soviet research and comparing it to more reliable Western studies to decide if it was credible. Sifting through this data was tedious. Atmospheric research can sometimes lead to exciting travel, but in this case, my journey was mainly from my desk to the coffee maker. I reviewed hundreds of reports, most of which were basic studies on climate patterns. I relied heavily on coffee and aspirin to keep myself alert. Then, among the stacks of papers, I found two reports that immediately stood out. These documents covered a recovery mission for valuable equipment at a remote Kazakh research site in what is now Banai province. The facility was abandoned in the 1970s following an extreme weather event, severe enough to prompt an immediate evacuation. The first report I read addressed the problem. The facility housed valuable equipment that could not be retrieved because helicopters couldn't access the site due to continuous hazardous weather. Railways serving the area had been closed, so the only way to reach the site was a 2-day hike across frozen tundra. While reading, I pictured this team of Soviet scientists trudging through the icy wilderness on a challenging, possibly dangerous mission. However, the report didn't make complete sense. It seemed unlikely that 6 researchers could transport heavy equipment and documents through such rugged terrain. I wondered if this mission was actually to assess the impact of the extreme weather event. The second report proposed a solution to the issue but left many unanswered questions. After combing through piles of paperwork and asking colleagues to look for any follow-up reports, I found nothing mentioning the Banai mission after the proposed start date of November 14, 1974. The names of the researchers assigned to the mission, like Igor Smirnov and Farad Zhukov, disappeared from all documents after that date, as if they simply vanished. I flagged the reports as inconclusive and asked our contacts at Almaty University for additional records, but none were found. Still, the mystery lingered, so I did some research on my own. A natural gas company, Kaznat Gas, now operates the Banai site, but this company has no online presence, social media, or stock listings. After weeks of piecing things together, I could only form a theory. Though this remains speculative, I believe that an unusually powerful atmospheric event struck the Banai site, but not an ordinary snowstorm. It was likely some intense electromagnetic or electrical storm, severe enough to disable helicopters. The Kazakh government likely sent scientists to survey the damage, but I think the mission encountered something more disastrous, resulting in their disappearance. People may dismiss this as wild conjecture, but as an atmospheric scientist, I see too many loose ends to ignore. Whatever occurred in Benai was likely kept secret, similar to how the Soviet government handled the Chernobyl disaster years later. With Chernobyl, they couldn't keep the cover, but they might have succeeded with Benai. What worries me is the possibility that this site, like Chernobyl, could still be hazardous. Kazakhstan's government might need to contain it, and if they fail, the consequences could be catastrophic. When asked if people should fear climate change, I often say there are other hidden dangers we should worry about, mysteries that could bring disaster far faster than we realize. During the summer between finishing my A-levels and starting university, I traveled to the United States as part of the Camp America program. For those unfamiliar, it's an exchange initiative that helps Europeans secure positions as camp counselors in the US. You pay a fee and they arrange a job for you at a camp in your preferred region, whether it's the East Coast, West Coast, or Southwest. You get the idea. I ended up at a camp near Malibu, California, which is one of the most stunning places I've ever seen. Most of my experiences there were amazing, and I have no regrets, but one child who attended the camp turned out to be one of the creepiest individuals I've ever encountered. Not only that, but he did something truly horrifying right before my eyes. We started to notice something unusual about a boy named Tyler when we observed him whispering to himself. One of the other counselors mentioned that she had asked him once, "Who are you talking to, Tyler?" His answer was completely unexpected and deeply unsettling. She had anticipated a response like, "No one," or "my imaginary friend," something innocent. Instead, he firmly denied whispering anything at all, leaving her at a loss for words. She followed up by telling him she had seen him whispering and reassured him that it was okay and he didn't need to deny it. Tyler then got surprisingly defensive, acting as though she was foolish for even asking, and again completely denied that he had been whispering. The bizarre part was how genuine he seemed, showing real indignation and frustration in his tone as he refuted her claims. At that point, it shifted from amusing to downright eerie. What if he truly didn't realize he was whispering? Maybe it was some sort of unconscious reflex. Regardless, we all became acutely aware that Tyler was not your typical child. One evening, I was asked if I knew any spooky campfire stories to share with the kids. I ended up telling them a simplified version of Stephen King's Cycle of the Werewolf, which happens to be one of my favorite short stories. It's a good little mystery with a solid twist at the end, so the kids were engrossed. After I finished, as they chatted about how great the story was, little Tyler suddenly exclaimed, "I'm a werewolf," with pride. The other kids immediately countered, "No, you're not, Tyler. Werewolves aren't real." But Tyler insisted he was, claiming they were wrong because he was one of them. The other kids began teasing him, and I recognized that same sincerity in him that my fellow counselor had noticed. He clearly wasn't a werewolf, but he spoke as if he truly believed he was one, like he felt it in his heart. I understood what my fellow counselor meant when she described how unsettling Tyler could be, but the truly terrifying moment didn't occur until later that night. The campfire storytelling was part of a trail camping excursion we organized with the kids, where we took them into the surrounding hills with camping gear so they could experience the outdoors. Because of that, when it was bedtime, I was much closer to the children than I would have been if we were back at camp in our separate cabins. Just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard a high-pitched scream close by. Since we were in a small valley, the scream echoed through the hills, heightening the fear. I jumped out of my sleeping bag, threw on my boots, and shone my flashlight around to figure out where the scream was coming from. It wasn't hard to pinpoint. It was the only tent with its zip and flap wide open, and I could see one of the kids' rear ends sticking out. I rushed over to see what was happening, thinking it might be some sort of spider or large bug that had gotten inside. What I witnessed next was one of the most chilling and haunting images I'd ever seen. The child who had half crawled into another kid's tent backed up a bit, still on all fours, and turned to face the light of my flashlight. It was Tyler, with a wide, maniacal grin on his face, blood smeared across his lips, chin, and teeth. What followed was a surreal moment where I realized what had happened. It was obvious, but I didn't want to accept it, no matter how much I wished it weren't true. It didn't change the fact that Tyler had bitten one of the kids who had mocked him, cutting into the meat of the child's leg. I sprinted back to my tent to grab the first aid kit and my phone. While on a speaker call with another counselor, fear gripped me, thinking Tyler might attack me next. It turned out he had fled into the hills, probably scared of the consequences of his actions. When I suggested that another counselor and I go look for him, the camp leader flatly said no and instructed us to let the police handle it. We all knew something was off with Tyler. We just didn't realize he was the most disturbed and dangerously violent kid any of us had ever encountered. I can vouch for every counselor on that, even those who had worked at several summer camps over the years. Don't quote me on this, but I think he eventually ended up in some kind of facility for troubled youth. I know the camp I worked for ended up getting sued by the parents of the bitten child for negligence, which turned into their own financial nightmare. Meanwhile, I was left with my very own horror story about Tyler, the boy who thought he was a werewolf.